up and, sort of polish them up a little bit, get all of that stuff sorted. And, that meant I kind of had a good idea of how long that would take. And that really organized my day. I had a very solid understanding of like, oh, okay, if I do this and I go there, I'm so keyed into thinking about the design, doing the sketches, working that out, that just kind of tended to happen. And then I'd walk back and I'd think about this other stuff, and then I'd get back and then I'd kind of set all these things up, and then I'd spend a few hours rendering, and then, then I kind of had control of my day. I really knew what I was and was not going to be able to do. So again, that's just an example of, trying to sort of work these things in. And again, I think this can be a similar idea where, you might have to move through space and time to really get your, that habit and that ritual working, because it's one of the most effective ways to do that. But what I noticed is, again, there's a lot of other ways you can do this if you don't quite have the luxury of being able to walk to a coffee shop for, and spend 3 hours in the middle of the day, because you're a professional artist. Because again, there's lots of things that happen to us where maybe you're wanting to do it as a hobby. Maybe, again, you're just wanting to carve out a little bit of extra time. There's lots and lots of different ways that this can sort of affect us. But that's just one good example of how I really found that utilizing these ideas of space and time, transporting myself somewhere, just made my entire day kind of work. Everything sort of clicked at that point. It's really important to understand that these ideas of habit are not necessarily a situation where you or I or anyone is trying to find like the perfect habit for us or a right or wrong answer. As time progressed, my life changed to the point where now I probably don't have 3 hours in the middle of the day where I can really just go to a cafe and sort of do that. At that point in time, I was often, spending, some of the nighttime, working on my work. I'd often sort of make that switch where I'd sort of, we'd go out in the day, do fun things, go out for lunch a lot. And because you can work from home, you can work whenever you want. I'd come home and I'd be sort of, working on some of these things. Again, not a lot of thought process, but a lot of rendering and that kind of stuff. I'd be working on that from, like 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. or something like that. And whatever happened that day, right? I just sort of finished the work that needed to be done. Sometimes it would be done here, sometimes it would be done there. So, now that I have sort of other responsibilities, like, sort of young children and stuff like that, it's just not possible to do that. And anyone who's been in that situation is like, can attest to this, is sort of your range of options decreases, right? And I think there's nothing sort of, again, good or bad about any of these things. I think that often it's so important to understand that the 17-year-old who is struggling with how do I stop playing, 20 hours of video games a day, and the person who is sitting there going like, please, how can I find 1 hour a day in my busy schedule to just do something that I want to do? We're all really dealing with the same problem, even though it doesn't quite seem that way. And we're often going to use the same tactics, I think, to get out of that situation and find the time. So again, I'll unpack some of this in some of the following episodes, but one of the ways that you sort of notice these ritualistic events occur is through modifying the spatial environmental situation. So again, if I have a different computer, I tend to do different things on it. If I go to a different physical location, I tend to become a different person. I tend to think different things. I get keyed into it. And the process of going there, the process of actually traveling there, and what I would do would just naturally sort of key me into that. It's an on-ramp and an off-ramp to this event. And I think as my understanding of a lot of this stuff has progressed, I've really been able to kind of start to hack these things. So I really try and make sure that I do different tasks in different areas of the house. So right now, again, I have to do most of my work in the middle of the day, and I can't necessarily stay up all night and do whatever I want. So what I've noticed is that, when I'm doing writing or planning or thinking, I will do that kind of in a sort of Moleskine style sort of journal or something like that. And I just make sure that I do that outside on like a couch, right? I sort of have like an outdoor couch in my garden, and I can go do that there. And, when I'm sort of thinking, or I need to plan this, or I need to write comic book episodes, I go there. And what I'm really trying to do is make sure that I keep this studio, and particularly my workstation that I work on, I really want that to be just for doing work. And that is because I'm going back to that initial idea where when I sit down at that desk, I want to just naturally feel like, oh, what should I do? Oh, that's right, I work here. If I focus too much on typing there, again, even that will really kind of make me a little bit confused. Or often what I'll find is, again, if I'm trying to do a different mental task at the same workstation, it's a little bit jarring because I'm like, I'm normally doing this here. And so it takes a while to get into the flow. Whereas one of the most effective strategies
Hey guys, it's Adam from Mr. Pixel, and welcome back. Today, I'd like to offer you some advice to help you live a healthier and happier life. What is it, and why do I want to talk about it? How to recognize symptoms in yourself, and furthermore, what to do about it. Taking into account, very clearly,
you can employ is to just change the space that you do a particular task in, because it will align your mental focus and your sort of mental habitual action. And so again, there's lots of things that I do there, right? What I tend to do is I use a pencil, right, in a again, sketchbook, journal. If I'm sort of planning things, I don't type it, because when I'm typing, to me, computer equals drawing and work or something like that. And again, it's just all these little things where I found, again, through experimentation, that if I just kind of do it this way, I'll just kind of sit down and I'll do this thing. And it's a creative aspect. So it's not that I can't do those things typing. It's that I tend to be more creative when I'm using a pencil and a journal. And there's neither right nor wrong. That just tends to be what happens. So I'll leverage that. If I go outside, I'm just used to sitting down in that particular place, and it's not anywhere fancy. It's just kind of what I've sort of gotten used to doing. And it's just the ideas flow. I think about writing, I think about plot, I think about script. And then if I come inside, I'll sit down at the workstation, and then I'll just kind of do the drawing part of like what I'm doing that day. Or I'll sit down at this workstation and I'll be doing the recording this. I have sort of different situations and sort of desks and things for doing different things. And I found that's like a very, very easy way of creating a natural onboarding and offboarding, sort of on-ramp, off-ramp for, particular tasks. So again, that's just an example of how, I've sort of progressed through my career at different points. And I want to share those things with you, so that, again, you can understand sort of how they've affected me, and how I think they can affect you, no matter what sort of stage of your artistic journey you're at. But yeah, I found that the more I understand these things and the more I'm able to employ them, the more flexible I found it. And sometimes, again, it's a little bit mysterious, a little bit magical, right? There's some things where I find it's easy to change, and there's some things where it's like not. And I think it's just important to appreciate, again, the things that you like doing and the things that work for you, the things that key you into a particular environment. It might be music, it might be again, like smell, it might be the like the feeling of like some random thing that you never kind of think of, right? Like I think a lot of it is probably, when I draw with one pencil versus another pencil, there's probably a whole bunch of muscle memory stuff that's happening there that is making me think a particular way. And if you do that for hours and hundreds and thousands of hours of doing a particular thing, it's like these silly little things that can be a huge benefit when you're trying to get yourself into a particular mindset. Now, again, it might seem like, oh, that's just a bit wishy-washy, like, oh, you're just being precious, right? That's just kind of artist, talk. But these are the things that really make a difference when it comes to productivity. And I think a lot of people struggle with these things. And I think if you can master them and understand the specific little bits and pieces that really make you tick, that's when you can take conscious control of the habitual systems and turn that into a ritual that you are actually creating to consciously design and engineer these sort of systems of sitting down and doing the thing that you actually want to do. All right, so as I said, I really want to dig into more of the tactical nature of this in some following episodes, but hopefully I've made the case about ritual and habit and how important I think this is for developing a good positive relationship to art throughout your artistic journey. But I do want to sort of talk about the takeaways, right? Like how do we sort of think about this set of information and all of the things I've talked about, from a few different viewpoints. From an analytical point of view, if we think about the sort of scientific case for this or the thinking case for this, to my mind, there's lots of evidence of this out in the world that much of what we are doing is not necessarily us making these conscious choices, that to a certain degree we're running on rails, we're running through these sort of grooves and systems of our own mind that are very repetitive in nature. Often the things that we say we're doing as like a conscious effort are actually either post-rationalized or they're just not even that, they're just what we did yesterday. And I think there's plenty of sort of evidence for this throughout history. And I think if you just open your eyes and look around, you see that in most cases, this is actually what's happening. I also think that, again, we can really understand how important these ideas of ritual and space and having on-ramps and off-ramps to our creative time is really critical. As artists, we're in a unique position where the thing that we're doing really requires us to have this kind of focus where we go into this place and we feel right. We feel as if we're in the right area. We feel as if, things are going well. We've got a positive relationship to it. And we also have a lot of control over this, and that can be good and bad. Many of these ritualistic systems are actually created by people, not necessarily because they're thinking of it that way, just because that's how the incentive schemes work. If you're running, again, like a small sporting school or something like that, you're trying to get kids to go and do a thing, you kind of make it fun. You develop those gamification systems. If you're trying to get people to play video games, again, you work all the dopamine systems. You work these natural things that exist within the biological human to make them do something. But as artists, we are often we're just by ourselves, and we're kind of sitting there on our own, and there's a much wider range of what we can and can't think and feel. We're not in a social structure where it's like, oh, how do I act? Oh, that's right, this is how the other 10 people who are playing this game this or playing this sport are behaving. It's just us. And so it's important to understand that that is both the biggest risk for developing bad habits or getting in our head, having this artist angst, feeling bad or whatever. But it's also the best sort of offer of potentiality here, where you need to understand that you can kind of engineer this however you want. You have a lot of control here if you really put some time into figuring out how you tick. The top line analytical way of viewing this is that tweaking and modifying and developing your habits is the most efficient way to make sure that you're directing your energy and your life force over time. If you get these right, a lot of the other stuff just kind of happens on its own. So it's the most efficient way that you can change who you are and what you do every day. For the simplified version of all of this, I think we can fall back to a nice little classic by Aristotle via Will Durant. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. If we try and consider what some action steps or real sort of takeaways that you can go and do right now might be, I really want to unpack some of this tactical stuff over the following episodes. But what you can do is just try and observe where some of these ideas of ritual or habit have existed within your own career, within your own schedule, and whether or not you sort of see some of these ideas occurring in other people. And again, how you relate to some of your good or bad habits. Think about this stuff and how it has related to your life, because again, a big part of this is understanding and trusting that this stuff does work, because it's not always easy to develop one of these habits. You do have to work on it and have strategies and figure out what motivates you and what works. For me, again, this idea of situational change seems to be really sort of functional. And I've seen it work with other people too. But again, you might be different. A big part of this is, to a certain degree, understanding how you actually might go about, changing these habits in yourself. So part of that is understanding, what tends to motivate you, what responses and stimulus do you tend to really, respond to well. Again, that could be situational. It could be a matter of activity. There's a huge number of things that we'll go over. But again, just try and think of, what things have, helped you relate to this idea of habit or ritual, good or bad, in the past. Lastly, if we think about this from the spiritual aspect, I think this side of it should be fairly apparent. This idea of creating ritual and controlling the way that we feel by these kind of repeated actions and weird things that we do as humans has a very, very long history. And I think there's no real need to separate that from your experience as an artist, because I think we intuitively understand a lot of these things. The act of creation is a ritual, and I think it has a deep spiritual meaning to a lot of us. But even if it doesn't, I think it's still important to just appreciate that this idea of ritual is one of the best ways to kind of manifest a lot of your energy and emotion and turn it into productivity. This is how we have been, as a species, channeling a lot of our energy towards our sort of desired goals and outcomes throughout time. And you are no different. And all of this technology and all of this other stuff doesn't really matter if you're not able to sit down and do it and appreciate and enjoy that experience. So the idea of ritual is, I think, inherently spiritual. But even if you're not interested in any of that, it's a really important thing for you to realize that you are actually engaging in many of these things through sitting down, even if you don't think about it that way. And the more that you connect with that, I think the more you'll actually be able to motivate yourself across time to be the type of artist that you want to be. Okay, so that's probably all I've got time for in this particular episode. I find this topic fascinating mostly because, again, I think it does give a lot of meaning to what we do. It's also helped me to understand what I'm actually, doing day in, day out. And viewing it this way has been immensely useful when it comes to my own productivity, really kind of understanding and digging down into this stuff. And I have found that, again, it's a great mix of where all of these ideas of sort of science, spirituality, philosophy, and productivity kind of intermingle and really kind of meet in the middle. So I think this idea is incredibly useful. As I said, you can access this from some sort of spiritual angle if that's something that you have. I think that's a good way to sort of get into this idea and understand it. But if you don't, again, just understand there's a huge scientific and philosophical background and basis for these ideas. This is what we've been doing as humans since the beginning of, human time, let's say. And the more you master it, the more you hack it, the more efficient you're going to be at, engaging and channeling your energy across space and time. Let me know if you've got any comments or questions, etc. down below on YouTube. If you've got some time, leave me a review on the Apple Podcast app. or on YouTube, like, subscribe, etc. I've been really sort of excited to see the response that we've gotten so far to the podcast. So I really, really appreciate that. Again, I read all the comments. I appreciate all the time you're putting into here to, again, let me know your stories and how this stuff affects you. That's super useful. Goes into me thinking about, again, what sort of to talk about next. And again, super keen to hear about what everyone is going through when it comes to trying to get better at art. Anyway, other than that, we'll catch you around and I'll see you on the next one.
Hey there, welcome to the Drawing Codex. I think one of the biggest challenges that all artists face, especially when they're starting out and trying to reach those lofty heights of artistic mastery, or even just to get to a point where we feel like we're making progress, is to have a plan, to have some method to our madness, and some way to tell whether or not we are making progress. I think the most important thing here is to get on track and get to a point where you're actually making progress and you can see that you're making progress. This is something I've dedicated quite a bit of time to mentoring students over the years, and I found a number of things that I think work well as a framework. This is what I want to share with you in this video, where we talk about how you can make your own drawing/art master plan. Let's get started. Alright, welcome again to the Drawing Codex. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and I am essentially a self-taught artist. I learned how to do most of the things that I do, how to become a professional artist, while basically just sitting in a room at home on the internet learning to draw, learning to paint, learning to use Photoshop, learning to use 3D, learning to do all of it. Now, that's not to say I didn't use a lot of tutorials, I didn't have a lot of advice, but I was the one who was responsible, and if I sort of stopped, nothing would happen. And again, that's one of the reasons that I've sort of made this channel, where we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, things like comics, concept art, for video games, etc., etc., and we're about embracing that challenge of drawing, trying to make this fun so that we can actually do it. It while we're sitting at home or while we are responsible for it. And again, my primary focus is on the line and color style, which is something that I use every day to create comics and concept art, etc. If you want to learn more about the line and color style, you can check out my free quick start guide. It's designed to get you up and running quickly in Photoshop using the simple line and color process. You'll get my advice from going from the thumbnail to the finished product, and as well as all of the brushes, actions, and Photoshop documents, etc. that I use day to day. It's free, link will be in the description. Go check it out. Now, an interesting way to think about this that can help as a metaphor is to view what we're doing when we're building a plan as an artist as building a machine, building an engine. If we're stationary, if we're not sure where we're going, the first thing we need to do is actually build some structure within our life, some rituals, some habits, and just some machinery that will actually be able to create forward momentum that we can then start to drive and direct. What I consider to be the master plan is the nuts and bolts and the framework of that initial machine that gets us up and moving initially, and it has a number of key components. The first big part of this is about the motivation and sort of passion and inspiration side of this. This is an element that's easy to forget. It's easy to skip over, and it's something that sort of wanes over time. You can feel inspired one day, uninspired the next, but we need to feel inspired every day because art requires of us a lot of passion, a lot of ourselves, a lot of our emotions. That often is what makes the difference and makes people interested in our work. It's also what is likely to make you get up every day and draw. So the motivation side of it, I think, is the first most important aspect to get right. And we'll talk later in the video about some tactics and specific things you can do to make sure that this easily happens every day. The second thing here is understanding that art happens in a creation loop. There is a loop of first having an idea for what you're going to create that is often based on your inspiration and your motivation and why are you here as an artist? What do you care about? Again, is it video games? Is it manga? Is it comics? Is it drawing funny, cartoony, colorful stuff? Is it drawing sort of awful, horrific things that no one has seen and no one wants to imagine? What is it for you? That starts the idea. Now, throughout that idea, we have essentially the process that we use to create the image. And that's what you would consider to be your process, which can change depending on which image it is, and again, how much you finesse and define your own sort of steps. But there is a process by which you create art. Now, there is also a stage at the end of that process where you call it done. And I think that sort of completes the first half of that creation loop. It's also important in that loop to understand that in order to get good perspective on the work yourself, you have to put it out into the world in some way, shape, or form. This is really important because if you don't, then I feel like it's always possible to view it as like, oh, you know, that's sort of something I did, but I didn't put all of my effort into it, or one day I'll get better. It's important to understand where you are at this point in time. Calling something finished, putting it out into the world is a real clear signal to your subconscious mind and your conscious mind that that is what you have created and that is the best you could do given those particular circumstances. And I think that kicks off the next little sort of arc of the creation loop, which is where you consider what maybe you could have done better next time. It's this sort of constant iteration that is similar to the process of evolution of species, but also of your skill set. We need points of failure. We need things to assess that are real, not maybes, not ifs, not woulda, shouldas, but things that you know you need to improve so that next time you can do it better. As we sort of move into the last phase of a creation loop, you essentially take all of the knowledge that you've gained from this sort of previous creation loop and you feed that into the next idea you have. And it's this loop of sort of taking all of those concepts that will start to build momentum and also guide a lot of your efforts. Now, the reason this is important is that often things that go wrong in the later stages of a process can actually have a strong relationship to the first idea you had, the expectations you had going into that image, your intent going into that image, your skill set. There's a million things that can go wrong, and it's only when you complete this cycle that you have a chance to actually assess that and improve it on the next go around. The third thing that I think is critical is to build this as a habit. Now, you can maintain certain sort of levels of hustle culture or sort of self-pressure or motivating yourself in like a really intense way. We can sort of do this in short bursts. We can sort of put a lot of effort in. You can psych yourself up, you can beat your chest, you can really get motivated. But the thing that will carry you over time and allow you to focus more on what you're doing, less on trying to kind of psych yourself up into hustle culture or just, trying to sort of, motivate yourself against your own will, essentially, which I think is just you putting energy into an ineffective sort of loop. The thing that allows you to shortcut all of that is the act of a habit or an artistic ritual, which is a major part of what this channel is all about. And it's why I often build this concept into a lot of the courses that I create or run. This is where you can essentially hack and bypass a lot of the sort of artistic angst and, again, that idea of sort of having to get up in the morning and push yourself to create. If you make this a ritual, if you make this a habit, then eventually we are just creatures of habit and we just sort of do what we tend to do. You are what you repeatedly do. And what that means is that if you just get used to doing art, you will just kind of get up in the morning and feel weird and strange if you don't create art and if you don't create this space and times and sort of areas in your life where you just sort of go and sit down and create art. Making this a ritual, making this something that is a positive sort of momentum in your life is really critical because, again, once you do that, you are no longer sort of fighting yourself in the same way. Your habit takes over and you just tend to do it. The fourth thing that really makes a lot of this work is tracking your progress. Now, you can do this any which way you want, but often if you are sort of falling along that creation loop cycle where you put it out into the world in some way, shape, or form, you naturally get some way to kind of track and have a collection of the things you have done and the things that you've done that you've called finished, which again is just as important. You can do a lot of things. You can have a bunch of stuff that's kind of half finished in folders here and there, half finished sketchbooks. The thing is to kind of make it into a piece of art and, again, track your progress as you sort of move along and create more and more pieces of art. There's a billion ways you can do this. You can create an Instagram account, an ArtStation account. You can just have a folder that you put all of your finished work into. It really doesn't matter. I think public accountability is really, really useful in this instance. And a great way to track your progress. Again, these are things that didn't really exist in the same way when, I was learning to sort of draw all these things, on the internet in the very, very early 2000s. You didn't have Instagram, you didn't have ArtStation, but these things are actually great tools for tracking your progress. Just remember, you can delete stuff later if you don't like it. If you become an amazing professional artist, you can delete all this stuff here. It doesn't matter. You're in control. The main thing is for you to track your progress because you can only tell whether or not the small little steps that you're making with those creation loops, one bit at a time, you only see the results of that effort, of your habits, of your sort of positive momentum. You only see it over time. And again, this is one of these things that I've been teaching hundreds of students in large classes who are at a university grade level really struggling to do this. And it's really only when we force people in those instances to track their progress that they even realize they're making any progress at all. You often get people will be at the end of their first year and they're just distraught because nothing's working, their art sucks. But then you show them how far they've come, right? You actually force them to say, hey, relax. Okay, let's go look at the first thing you came and showed us on week 1, right? Because again, we make it a process of, we make it like a requirement that people create art in those instances so that people can track it. And when they track it, they see they've improved. And I think if you track your work, you will notice, even if your improvement is not as fast as you want, you can see that there is a trajectory there. You are improving. And once you can see that velocity, you can either work to increase the speed of change, increase the speed of improvement, increase the quality of improvement, increase or change the direction and exactly where you're improving, whatever you want. But the first thing is to get some sense of direction and some sense of movement, and to be able to track that. Because once you do that and you do it over time, I think that's when, again, those little voices, the subconscious mind sort of starts to realize, hey, this is working. And if I keep doing it, and if I improve my efforts and I get better at this, then overall, I'm going to get there in the end. All right, so hopefully those ideas resonate and you can see how those ideas are critical to building some sense of forward momentum and being able to tell at a deep level where you're going and whether you're actually going anywhere, and whether or not you're having any movement. Now, let's talk a little bit about the tactics. What can we actually do on a day-to-day level, and what can you go away and do right now to make this happen? There's 2 elements to motivation and the inspiration side that I think are really simple that you can go away and do right now. The first is the idea of an influence map, and I'll put a link in the description to the influence map that I've used and I've sort of shown students and I put in all my courses. It's a simple sort of influence map meme that's on DeviantArt. It's been there for ages. There's actually a sort of updated new version of it that came out this year, which is really cool, that helps you sort of, make it up in Photoshop. But this is where you essentially really meditate and think about, what kind of artist are you? What do you actually like? Not what did some, art teacher in high school say was good about your work. Not what other people think is maybe, something you should focus on, but why are you here? Why are you creating art? What really motivates you? What do you really, really love? I found often this is a mix of things we aspire to from a technical standpoint. For me, it's also been, cartoons that I watched as a kid, and, I'll sort of watch that and I'll be like, oh man, like, it's all there. Half of the things I do are just from this one show I watched when I was 5 years old. But knowing that and respecting where you've came from and understanding where you want to go and understanding artists that you respect, art you really like. Again, this doesn't even have to be cartoony comic book art. It could be good industrial design. It could be good architecture. It could be good photography. It could be an amazing place in the world. Whatever inspires you is what you need to put on your inspiration map. The second thing there that you can do right now easily to help your motivation is to create a like list. And this is where you just get any bit of paper or maybe the first page in a new sketchbook and just literally write all the stuff you like to draw. It's so easy, and again, I am always guilty of this, where I get disconnected from what I actually like doing. I work professionally all day, every day, drawing. So in one sense, I'm sort of living the dream, but it's easy to lose little elements of why I really love to draw in, sort of working on one particular professional job that just doesn't allow me to do that, which is fine. That's just life. But it's on me to reconnect with those elements and sort of, make those lists and have lists of things that I want to draw in my sketchbook, because otherwise I often just sort of find myself sitting down and sketching and, and I'm forgetting all those things that I love to draw. Now, again, this is not what someone else thinks you should draw. This is what you want to draw. And it doesn't have to be avant-garde, doesn't have to be sort of, breaking boundaries. This can be really sort of generic, cozy, comforting stuff that you like to draw. Just write a list of, the top 20 things that you always love to draw. And that means that when you sit down and, you're thinking about, hey, I'm just going to make some art, right? You're trying to engage in this process. You have a ready list of things that, again, you've meditated on and thought about deeply that are always going to be fun. It's the process of doing this, as well as actually having the end result of this that you can reconnect with every time you sort of wake up and think about, what you're going to create, why you're here as an artist. It's a good way to anchor yourself. Obviously, I think the other thing you can do is really easy in terms of motivation these days. You can jump on Instagram or ArtStation or any of these sort of sites where people are sharing art, and you can see a lot of really cool stuff that people are doing. Again, the trick is that you want to do that, get excited, but also stay grounded and understand why you want to be here. It's easy to get excited about, someone else's amazing sort of art, and we can appreciate that and use that energy for sort of creation. But make sure that you channel that energy towards, your actual goal. Again, to that vector that you're trying to reach. I've wasted a huge amount of time in my life by just getting super excited about what someone else was doing, and then I sort of go and try and do that, and I realize, like months later, I'm like, what am I doing here? Why did I go for this direction? Again, because I didn't have that anchor. I didn't really understand, again, that I want to use that inspiration that I see out in the world, but I want to sort of use it as fuel for the machine that I'm building that is kind of headed in the right direction, that I sort of am very confident about. Again, it's maintaining that and understanding that not all art can be, everything to everyone. The type of art that I do is very sort of cartoony. It's very simple, and I really like realistic art as well. It's just not me in the end, though, and I always have to remind myself that again, this is truly what I like to do, and even though I can see a lot of cool stuff out there and sort of want to do everything, I have to focus on, again, the core of what I'm about as an artist. The only thing you really have to worry about on a tactical, practical level when it comes to the creation loop side of this is just make sure that you really put a lot of your energy into finishing work, even if it sucks, right? Even if you finish it and you're like, oh man, I could have done so much better. Yes, you could have, but you didn't. And I think it's often that negative stimulus that helps us to improve and helps us to get a rational understanding of where we are right now. And, that is just a natural process that your body and your natural learning modalities do quite well. We respond pretty well to negative stimulus as long as, again, no one's screaming at us, yelling at us, right? Just having that thing of, putting it out to the world, finishing it, and then realizing what that means, and maybe that next time we could do it differently. That really is the meat and potatoes, right? That is the bread and butter of what will make your entire sort of process work. Again, the other part of that I do really, really recommend is find some way to get it out into the world, to share it with other people. This doesn't necessarily have to be posting it on the internet so everyone can see. I know a lot of us can be very apprehensive about, publicly sharing work. Although, again, at that point, you have to question, why do you want to be an artist if you don't want to share your work with people? Again, it's rare you're going to magically turn some corner and suddenly think your art is amazing. Most artists I've met, and you'd be surprised again, most artists who are absolutely amazing at the top of their game, still quite negative about their work, still only think about what they can improve. And I don't think I've met a single person who is going to sit there and say, yes, I'm an amazing artist. I've sort of learned everything and that's all there is. So part of what we're doing is learning to master and navigate those feelings and emotions and still put out work and see what feedback we can get. You could, however, just, post it to some sort of more private Discord group. You could have a more private group of people who you're sort of, dealing with. Whatever it is, it's mainly just solidifying the feeling that this work is done. It's the best you can do, but you're going to do better next time. In terms of building a habit, building a ritual, I think this is just as much a matter of building space, building time in your life as it is about focusing on getting the work done initially. Focus on making sure that you are finding some time in your busy life to do art, or you're finding some time to carve out space in your day somewhere that you're going to focus on art, and make sure that this is a regular occurrence. You'll find that habit and ritual responds well to regularity, to consistency. It's more important in the beginning to actually focus on consistency and just sort of sitting down than it is actually to do the art. I would recommend, for instance, that if you're trying to sort of really find some time to do this, don't even worry about drawing to begin with. Just sit down at your designated time in your designated space, open your sketchbook, and just don't do anything else. right? The more you focus on building that ritual for sitting down, doing the work, then eventually what will happen is you just sort of get used to that time, you get used to that space, and then you can start drawing. And eventually, again, if all of these things go to plan, what happens is you are sort of drawn to sit down at that time in that place and start to work. And that's just sort of naturally what happens. You sit down, your brain kind of naturally forgets about all the other stuff because you know you're task orientated in this place and time. Again, I'll do some subsequent videos sort of going a little bit more in depth in all of these tactical aspects, because I think this whole thing is super important for artists to get control of. There's a lot of tactical things you can do when it comes to building a ritual and a space, setting up your sort of area and thinking about how to get into the right mindset. But at its core, think about it as building space within your day and try to protect that space from distraction. Tracking progress is super important, as I said, and there's a number of things you can do to help yourself with this. Again, I think if you're comfortable posting on Instagram, posting on ArtStation, putting your work out there, that does a really good job of just tracking progress. And you can then always go back to those things. You can share this progress with other people, and you can both sort of, hopefully as the years and, months roll by, you start to see that progress more and more. A couple of things that are really good to do to sort of help you along in terms of making progress is to create a set of folders or a set of images that contain images that you like, that are kind of your goal images. What, in terms of color, vibrancy, energy, mood, tonality, are you trying to do with your art? Similar to your influence map maybe, but again, more specifically based on what you're trying to do right now with your art. It could be, again, a certain quality of anatomy, of rendering, of perspective, whatever it is. Create a set of images or a folder of images that sort of manifests that feeling. And then what you want to do is drop your images in that folder and then start to compare what you're doing versus sort of your goals necessarily, or essentially. And just notice the differences. If you notice those differences and pay attention to those differences, then again, it's feeding your subconscious mind. It's helping you to track that progress. As you improve, you're not only sort of training, again, the fact that you are improving, but you're also starting to help, again, with the direction. Like, where are you going? It's not just a matter of improvement. It's a matter of improvement along the path that you actually want to make progress along. Anyway, that's the basics of the machine that I think you can start to build. Focus on motivation, inspiration, passion, because we're artists and it's important to be passionate and motivated about drawing. Secondly, realize we're in a creation loop. You need to finish the work in order to think about what needs to be done on the next one. And you need to put it out into the world to help you do this. Thirdly, if you're struggling with actually just sort of getting up and doing this, the biggest hack I have found is, as I said, the ritual. Focus on building habits. You can build bad habits or good habits, but typically we are just what we repeatedly do. If you do it and you keep doing it, you'll just tend to kind of keep doing that for no good reason forever and ever and ever. That's how we are wired. So if you can harness that, you can bypass a lot of the angst, a lot of the hustle, a lot of sort of pushing yourself day in, day out, a lot of fighting against yourself. It's a much better way to apply energy towards a goal. And lastly, as I just said, track your progress. Make sure that you can see this forward momentum. Now, you might say, hey, but I've only got sort of rubbishy images, right? I've just got piles and piles of crap, right? And I don't like it. That's even better. The worse the images are now, the more easy it's going to be for you to see some progress in the future. So if you have a whole bunch of stuff, you're not happy with it, trust me, track your progress anyway. One day you'll look back on those and that will be the fuel that you'll be able to add to the fire that will sort of help you understand that you are improving, that you can track your progress, and that'll give you confidence to know that if you keep at it, you'll make more progress. Because the real danger with art is that it's not like a lot of modern culture, which is about instantaneous feedback, instantaneous results. Art takes a lot of time to master, and it is a long game. It is more a marathon than a sprint. So what you need more than anything else is confidence and sort of a trust in your abilities, a trust in this machine that you're building, a trust in your plan. Anyway, that's all I've got for this one. Let me know if you've got any questions or comments, extra things I can expand upon. Again, I'll make some more videos covering these things in a little bit more detail, but I wanted to do an overview to really get this idea across. Catch you around. Happy drawing. If you want to be a working concept artist, an artist who uses their artistic skill in the pursuit of design, especially these days in the video game industry or the film industry, one of the biggest questions is how do you actually improve the design aspect of your craft? How do you get better at making things in a design process? That's what I want to discuss in this video. I think there are 4 main things that we have to consider here, and 4 main things that you can build separately. And I think it's important to distinguish them as being separate. Let's jump in, get started. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and a lot of that has been spent as a concept artist, just drawing random things for video games mostly, but also feature animation and some film stuff. So basically in that case, what I'm doing is I'm using the drawing skills that I've built and a lot of the design skills that I've built in the pursuit of working in a production environment and helping to design and figure out what the stuff in games and films, etc., should look like. Now, I made a video recently talking about art versus design, and my basic point there was that the design is the thing that will often make you the most money, especially if you just sort of want to get a job and work on, some sort of big project if you have a desire to work in the video game industry or something similar. The design is the thing that will actually often get you employed. The design is often the way that you provide value in that production chain. And I think it is the most important thing to work on and really get sorted. So the question is, how do we actually improve that? How do we work on getting better at design? And I'm talking specifically here as if we're getting better at design as artists, right? As artists who especially are trying to draw cool stuff from our imagination for video games that have a high sort of fantasy quotient, right, where we're designing monsters or creatures or things for science fiction and fantasy. That's sort of where I'm coming at it from. Now, the 4 things that I think are really important to consider are firstly the idea of understanding and researching and becoming immersed in the idea of a design ethos. So this is where you can think about the theory of design. And you might go and read a whole bunch of different books, right? So this is where, you can think about the design as being a global concept. It's something that people access when, they're doing advertising. So, you could read something like Ogilvy on advertising. The reason something like this is important, and it's important to think of the design sort of theory and ethos, is that the more different elements you can bring into your game, the more unique and interesting your designs are likely to be. Often the way to create really interesting designs is through the thinking process. As I said in that previous video, it's often about thinking about functionality and functionality mixed with what other people think things are. And I think it's this general design ethos that you're going to find a lot of people in a lot of different industries talking about, from again advertising, marketing, architecture, automotive design. Again, there's a foundational concept there where we're sort of creating things for other people and our art has a high level of functionality. And I think the more you can read and research and immerse yourself in that stuff, the better your overall artistic and design process is going to be. Now, that stuff isn't going to directly, make your drawing or design better. It's more going to lay a foundation and an ability to kind of understand often what people are talking about and just to sort of allow your mind to see things from different angles. So for me personally, I might read Ogilvy on advertising, and again, it has nothing to do with designing monsters for science fiction games, but the things there that he's talking about are very much about how, ads and marketing and advertising sort of is viewed by an audience. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there that, look, it's not a one-to-one, right? It's not like you're going to read that book and that's going to be the how-to for concept design. But I think the more of that ethos of design stuff you can fill your mind with, the better you're going to be able to understand the process and be a little bit less intimidated by the concepts of, art direction, working in production environments, and especially viewing the audience and how the audience is going to view your design. Things that you can actually do to really move the needle and help yourself in this is potentially watch design-focused YouTube channels and try and view yourself as potentially being able to get more from watching channels and things that talk about design from different industries. What you'll find is that the types of concept art tips you're going to get from people who are really embedded in, the concept art industry is that there's a lot of industry specific stuff, terminology and process. And again, we'll talk about this later, but I think it's important to separate the idea of process, right? You may have heard things like doing, a series of black and white thumbnails, and, you pick one of those black and white thumbnails and then, you build that up, and people kind of think, well, that's concept design. And that's a process for concept design. And I think, if you go and look at architecture or, automotive design, which again can be quite similar to concept art, but if you look at those things, you will see the through lines and the similarities between all design processes. And even though it's a little bit more abstract, I think the more you can do that, the better of an understanding you'll have for it. So looking at architecture and looking at industrial design and trying to understand, like, why are those things good and how, did those people solve problems and create interesting solutions with different architectural problems. There's also a lot of, specific architecture that you can actually apply to concept design as well, because often we build buildings and that sort of thing. So the goal here with understanding this first concept of design ethos is to avoid getting too stuck in the weeds of concept art for video games, because what you tend to find is everyone else is doing that. And if you want to build your design up, the more you can bring in from other disciplines, the easier your job is going to be when it comes to potentially being a little bit more unique, a little bit more interesting. Again, if you just stick to video game stuff, you're probably going to understand a lot of the industry specific things. But when it comes to bringing in extra design knowledge, you can quite easily get a lot of really good information just from studying these books, looking at how other people design things in different industries, and again, just trying to fill your mind with how people solve problems and the theory behind that, because people have been doing this for hundreds and thousands of years, and a lot of these basic concepts haven't changed. And if you learn them and you're able to sort of see them from different industry perspectives, it can be a really, really helpful tool in your toolkit. The second thing here is the idea of research. So what we want to do is develop a methodology of research when it comes to both the functionality of the thing that we're designing and, again, the iconography or the ideas behind what other people are sort of going to expect to see. So in my previous video, I gave the example of a pirate ship or something like that. But you could also use the basic concept of a pirate. So when you're researching, the trick is almost for you to actually figure out how you best understand the world. And this could be through visual research. But again, it's like exactly how do you like to do it? If you really think about building a process and a system for yourself for how you research things, then that's like a skill. It's a habit. It's a process that you can go to again and again. And again, it might have layers. It might be about figuring out if you do need to draw something really quickly or design something quickly, how do you get a quick read on what that should be, understanding the functionality and the iconography of that. And, as you work on a longer project, you might maybe read some books on the subject, again, about pirates, how they lived, how they approached life. And the more information you can get there, again, it's not always just about finding visual reference and creating a mood board. The better you actually understand the subject in detail, the more you're going to be able to sort of, again, extract little ideas out of there that other people aren't going to get if they're just kind of going to Pinterest and typing in something simple. So when it comes to research, again, I'm not really giving you any sort of quick how-to, but I'm saying you should view the research process as a skill that is separate from all the rest, that is much better if you tailor it exactly to how you think. You might be more intellectual, you might be more visual, you might in general be more interested in the iconography than the functionality. A lot of these things are in many ways related to what type of project you take on. If you take on a very cartoony project, we're never really going to get to the hardcore functionality. It's mostly about iconography. It's like, how do I make this little cartoony cute character feel like a pirate? How do I make this little icon of a ship feel like a ship? And in many of those cases, you're dealing with stuff that is almost an icon anyway, these little cartoony characters. So, if you're very iconically minded, you like simplifying things, then that's where, again, you're going to be looking much, much more at the iconography of the subject matter and, like what makes a pirate ship look like a pirate ship all the time, because those design challenges are actually really important. You might have a whole bunch of little pirates or pirate ship for some pirate cartoony mobile game, and you got to separate them all out and sort of deal with all this kind of design work, but you don't have much detail to work with. Again, that's where understanding the iconography, the advertising side of it might be a lot more useful, and your research process might primarily focus on those visual things. How have other people solved these problems? And again, just looking for how to design that game and make it function. Versus if you're designing a realistic pirate game, that's where you might, go in and read the books, because if you can extract a little bit of extra information and nuance from many of the great sort of books on what it was like to be a pirate in real life, then that is going to add an extra little layer onto your design that is just going to separate you out a little bit. And again, people are not necessarily always going to be able to see this or spot this, because the research process is specific to you. It's about how you think and how you can extract information out of there. So it's not that people who read books on their subject matter are better than people who don't. You might need to go to a museum. You might need to see it. You might need to lay hands on the subject matter. Seeing it in real life might be way, way more valuable than reading a book. Again, this is about you understanding how that functions and making sure that your research process is tailor-made to yourself, and that it allows you to improve your designs and make them a little bit more special. Just quickly, if you want to learn a little bit more about the illustration advice that I have, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It talks about some of these same topics, but mostly related to illustration and how I sort of go about getting more detail and polish in my work, which again doesn't have a lot to do with design, but you hear a lot there about my journey and kind of how I solved some of these overall sort of problems in my career and allowed myself to get my drawing to a point, again, where I could get these types of design jobs and, handle the drawing side of this, which is a completely different kettle of fish. But anyway, check that out if that's something you're interested in. It's free. A link will be in the description. All right, the third thing that I think we can really separate out is the idea of the design process. So this is where before I talked about the idea that often if you really only are just following concept art tutorials, a lot of what you're going to see is process. People are saying, here is a design process. This is the design process that we use in the industry. And again, that can involve doing thumbnail sketches, doing multiple thumbnail sketches, then doing cleaned up thumbnail sketches, and then doing options for the different heads, etc., etc. And again, you might learn tricks in Photoshop for how to do that, how to quickly create iterations. All of that stuff is process. It's technique. It's how you get the ideas from your head and other people's heads onto the page, and a lot of those things are very streamlined. You're learning a lot of efficiency. And efficiency is not necessarily what you want when you're beginning. I think when you're beginning, you really need to understand the design process behind that. I see a lot of people just following cookie cutter design processes and thinking that concept art is just about doing black and white thumbnails and then blowing that up and then rendering over the top of it. The thought process is far more important, and that's really what you need to learn. And I think you should separate out the idea of how you actually do that, how you actually take maybe a series of, again, you have amorphous ideas in your head. You have what people are expecting to see. There's what the project needs. There's how you think that maybe you could make this interesting for you as an artist. There's maybe some books you've read. There's some visual, language stuff. There's some iconography. There's some functionality. Trick is, how do you actually turn that into a drawing, right? And how do you make it so that other people can get involved in that process? And that's where, again, what we're doing is we're learning those concept art processes. And this, again, is something where you can look at someone else's process, but in many ways, a lot of that stuff happens in your own mind, and you are working through it as well as other people. And the main advice here that I'd give you, as opposed to just saying this is a separate thing, don't get it confused with understanding design or understanding how to find reference. Again, someone else's way of finding reference is not going to be yours, and this is the same. You need to find your own process and way of thinking through this. You can certainly use other people's processes, and you can learn really efficient, systematic ways of, turning vague ideas into more refined ideas. And there's nothing wrong with looking at how that sort of has been done. But don't underestimate how personal these things are if you actually really want to get good at this. And, for me personally, if I just use that standard cookie cutter concept design process, I don't really enjoy it. I don't feel like I get, results that are that sort of good. My process, again, it depends on the subject matter. I sort of know from experience what I need to do, and it sort of changes based on how much information I already have, how much I've done stuff that's similar before. It's very, personal, and it's really changes from project to project and what we need. So if we take example that concept of doing thumbnails, right, where we focus on shape and primary form, from a design aspect, you have to understand how all those things fit into a process. So working on big shapes and thumbnails first is really good if A, you're stuck and you're finding it difficult to push the larger shapes. And that can happen because you're drawing stuff and you kind of get jammed into thinking about the details and just breaking out and going, okay, I'm just going to do the silhouettes. I'm just going to design, 20 silhouettes on a page. That's a really good design exercise to break your own mind out of thinking about detail and also to ideate, what these different bigger shapes might be. So it's a good design tool, but it's not always the way that every concept art thing needs to start. Hopefully that's really obvious, but again, it seems to me from the stuff I see that is not obvious, right, based on a lot of tutorials. Now, the other thing there that you can use that for is in situations where the silhouette is a primary thing that you're designing. Now, this typically has been the case in video games, and especially where we have lower tech video games where you have to really push the silhouettes to make it clear what's actually happening on screen. So when we had very, very limited polygon budgets, if you're thinking about, your sort of Quake 1, probably not Quake 1, Quake sort of 3, that sort of PlayStation 2 era, focusing on the big shapes is kind of good because that's all you have. You don't have a lot of other ability to really effectively differentiate characters. And secondly, a lot of games were really fast-paced and fast-moving, and you need to focus on big shapes so you can tell the enemies apart. Similarly, if you're working on a mobile game, often you're dealing with tiny little iconic style characters, and again, just working the silhouette and the bigger shapes is really important. So depending on what project you're working on, that tool of focusing on the silhouette and ideating just the silhouette and sort of ignoring everything else can be really critical because it allows you to focus on the iconography of the silhouette and how that is going to effectively communicate what the thing is to the viewer. But that is not design. That's not the whole, that's not the whole thing. There's more to it, obviously, as I've said. So try and understand those tools, learn them, figure out your own, and experiment. Because again, if you figure out exactly what works for you, don't feel like you're not going to be able to work. You don't need to do exactly the same process that everyone else does, as long as you can involve other people in the process and iterate and ideate and be flexible. An art director doesn't care how you get the results. They don't care what you start with or whatever. Again, hopefully you'll have the flexibility there, but trust that you figuring out your own process and what works for you is going to be really, really important, and it's worth pursuing that and understanding that you're unique and your design process will be unique as well. The fourth thing is that you want to consider working professionally, the working side of it, as being almost a separate skill that you're trying to develop. And I think if you can get really good at the working thing, that often that's what will get you employed. You can always build your ability to get better at reference, to understand the design ethos, to read more books, to be able to converse in those, more ethereal design terms, etc. You can always, again, improve your process. But the thing that often people are looking for is, can you actually be useful on a team? Can you insert yourself in a production environment and add value? And I think this is where understanding where you actually want to work, how that actually functions, what the common technical limitations are in those production environments, and just in general what people kind of want out of a concept artist in different industries. And again, this changes. It's not one of these things that's sort of fixed, but for instance, if you're looking at working in video games, you can be really good at the research, at understanding design ethos, at again having sort of design process. But for instance, a really big part of working in video games is understanding that the rigging for characters, for instance, is extremely expensive. So a big part of what we do when currently in video games is designing different variations of characters, but we have to design them in such a way that the animation rig doesn't interfere with the proportion. So you can't just design any character with any proportion, and there are often limitations in terms of what is easy to animate, what's not easy to animate. There are often points where, again, we want things around the belt line or something to stay static. We don't want that to expand too much. Why? Because everyone's going to use a common animation loop for picking a gun out of a holster or something. So we're going to have sort of different sizes and stuff like that, but you can't change the proportions too much. You can't change where certain things are because people just want to reuse animations, and if they can do that, that saves a lot of money. So just understanding those industry common problems that you're dealing with and that often you spend a lot of time wrestling with as designers. The other thing that often happens is you see variations of creatures. The reason you see variations of creatures and monsters, and the prototypical one is just this one's green and this one's blue, right? And it's a different monster, and it's like the only reason for that is just it's expensive to design and animate and create two vastly different creatures. It's a lot more effective to design sort of classes of creatures and then sort of create variations on them. And one of the primary design skills that if you build will allow you to get really, not easy work, but will make it a lot more possible for you to get work in the video game industry is, figuring out how to make really interesting variations where you really make the character look different, even though it's based on the same base animation rig and to a certain degree the same base kind of model and everything like that. So, that's a skill where it's very industry specific and it's very much about understanding what the production needs and how you can help on that production. And I would say, the better you get at that, the more employable you're going to be. But often when we're starting out, we sort of see just these big, the big art books. You see something like, I think this is like the Rogue One art book, right? And it's a pretty cool art book, but you're going to see a lot of stuff that's a little bit more flashy than that. You're going to see the stuff that looks really sort of cool, and look, that is a big part of concept art. But a lot of what we do is wrestling with this. Like, how do I make this like ogre guy look different? I got to do like 5 ogres, and I can't change this bit, I can't change that bit. I can change the face, but can't change it that much. And so you sort of really work on like sticking bits on, or making it feel like this one maybe lives over here and this one lives over here because they've got different coloration or different sort of texture on their skin or something like that. So that's where, again, the more industry specific you can be, the better you're going to be employable. And it's so important to view these 4 things as being separate, because if you work on them separately and you understand what's valuable and what is the most valuable, and maybe you're really good at some of these things to begin with. Some people are good at research. Some people are just really good at sort of working in teams to begin with. Personally, I'm not that good generally. I didn't come out of the factory good at working with others and sort of working within a team. I had to really work on that aspect of understanding that and trying to get good at working in a production environment, right? The drawing was kind of okay. Me coming up with my own ideas is kind of okay. Involving other people in the design process was something that, I really had to work on, right? So, for me, again, the functionality side of it is something I feel like I inherently sort of understood to a certain degree. When I was, drawing my pirate book, I went and bought, all these books on, how pirate ships are made. I tried to go and, find real cutlasses and real flintlock pistols. That kind of came easy to me. But again, working with others in a production environment was very, very challenging for me. And, maybe to a certain degree still is. I'm probably not the best at that. But all of these things are separate. There's 4 things. The first is design ethos, reading the books, understanding the design process, design history, looking at the history of design, understanding how design changes over time. Second is reference, understanding how you understand and get good at extracting information from the world so that you can create a nice understanding and collection of reference for each project. The third thing is the process, figuring out how do you physically take all that stuff, turn it into a finished design or a process for design, a range of sketches. Again, what are they for you? Do you want to do in the beginning a huge array of really sketchy sketches? Again, will that work? Is that what you want? Do you want to do, maybe that for yourself, but then, only do a few much tighter set of sketches that you send to someone? Do you want to render them? Do you want to do them in black and white? Do you start with color? Whatever it is, right? That's where your process is really important, understanding that. And the 4th thing is working in a particular industry. And just understanding that the design requirements, the skills you're going to have to build, and the processes you're going to really have to practice in order to get in the door, be useful as soon as possible, and hopefully make yourself employable and continually employable, are really important. And that'll be different depending on whether you're working in, feature animation, feature film is, like live action is certainly very different. And again, working in, video games is going to be different, but also, working in realistic, AAA, highly detailed video games is going to be different to working in mobile games where things are often by default a little bit more iconic and a little bit more, symbolic. So you have to focus on different things. You have to tailor all that stuff that I talked about to a particular design process. Anyway, that's all I've got. Hopefully this is interesting. Let me know if these design focused talks help you. If you've sort of thought about this, if you want a little bit more industry specific knowledge, again, specifically about how you get good at doing stuff for video games, how you get good at designing stuff for animation, etc., let me know. But that's all I've got. Catch you around. Happy drawing. Hey there, welcome to the Drawing Codex. In this video, what we're going to do is discuss comic books and the comic book style that you choose, whether you go for something detailed or simple, and how that affects your process, the amount of time it takes, and to a certain degree, your mental sanity when you have to deal with the patience that comes up when you have to create larger, more detailed, more nuanced pages. This is actually in response to a comment that someone left on one of my previous videos talking about comic books and how long pages take. I think this is a really interesting topic. Again, I have been a professional comic book artist and I draw stuff all day, every day for a living. Let's dive in and see if we can answer this, and in the process discuss a lot about comics, style, and how they affect you, the artist. Let's get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex again. My name's Tim McBurney, and here on this channel I'm all about helping you draw cool stuff from your imagination, which is something that you sort of do a lot in comics. How to embrace the challenge of drawing, how to get professional results, and how to master the craft of line and color illustration. So this is in response to a question. The question is as follows, and I'll just read it out. Thank you for this video. Right now I'm currently struggling with finding the right style for comics that is something I'd be happy with, but at the same time would be reasonable to do time-wise. A current problem I have is that I like to draw lines/line art because I started drawing with fine liner pens for years, but at the same time I find I like to digitally color like a painter would, and I just don't really like the look of that flat toon shading. However, because of this, I often run into the problem that the image as a whole either needed more work to at least get it to an acceptable level, or that I put way too much time into it that wouldn't be sustainable for a comic making career. I can't seem to manage a middle ground. I'm sorry if this ends up kind of vague, but do you have any insight for this problem? I sure do. Now, the reason I do is because I personally have struggled with this quite a bit. As you may know from looking at this channel, I do sort of quite a wide range of different art styles. You know, I've drawn comic books, which, you know, kind of are in that sort of line and color style. And I'll talk about, you know, the evolution of some of those styles that I used on the different books. But, you know, I've also, you know, like painted a lot of stuff for illustration. And I really started with a very similar sort of conundrum. And firstly, it was just that I actually wanted to sort of pencil, ink, draw, color, write, letter. I wanted to do the whole book. And in the Western system, that was kind of challenging. And a big part of this question, I think, is very much linked to publishing schedules, or as you're saying, what is reasonable from a production level, and to make sure that that will work for a career. Now, I personally sort of grew up not really like, I wanted to draw comics, but I wasn't sort of particularly attached to any style. I liked painting, I liked fantasy art, I liked a whole bunch of things, and in my mind I kind of wanted to combine these. Now, there's lots of examples of very, very detailed comic book art, and I've sort of said before, if you look at a lot of the the big sort of French albums and things that I sort of grew up reading, and I was exposed to a lot of the typical translations that were around in the late 90s, from like heavy metal books and those kind of things. But the point is that there are industries and ways of sort of you creating art professionally that will allow you to spend quite a lot of time on a page and really make it look amazing. So one of the ways that I kind of solved this for myself is getting into the French comic book industry, which basically allowed me that 4 to 5 days to finish a page. But this issue of the style, I think, was still a problem for me. And although, again, I wanted to render and add a lot of that sort of painterly detail, and almost, again, I was sort of a little bit obsessed with trying to sort of mix up styles and use different things. And I think I actually have transitioned to a much sort of flatter, sort of toon shaded sort of comic book style currently. And a big reason for that is specifically that allows me to create more comic book pages in the same amount of time. But I really struggled with that early on. Now, I think this is just generally quite a conundrum that can come up, because if you have styles and ways of creating stuff currently, again, you might like video game art, you might like illustration, and there's a strong feeling that like you like this thing, right? You have a real passion for it, and you also like comics. And the question is sort of, how can you combine these? How can you do what's natural? If you haven't drawn a huge amount of comics though, it's tricky to know how to actually meld those styles together. And it's also tricky to understand why some of those styles exist in the first place. And that's really what I want to address here in this first sort of point that I can use to try and answer this question. That is, why are a lot of comic books heavily stylized to begin with? To my mind, style has a number of different elements. One is that we have certain idiosyncrasies that we can just sort of have as an artist. You have a particular line style, right? You might be thinking that some people only use straight lines. Some people only use curved, flowy lines. Some people like to draw things simpler. Some people like to draw things with a lot of texture or sort of hatching. Now, there's also the more subtle, just little things that we will do as artists, the little inflections of the pen, little tweaks here and there, mistakes. Again, things that I would label as an idiosyncratic style. They're things that are very personal to you. The other sort of element of style here that I think we can look at is the functional level of style. Now, this is where, again, we're more thinking about things like, what medium are we creating in? What is the function of this art? Who is looking at it? And what is the natural way that our process and our creation will create art that sort of fits in that groove? And the style, I think you will find, often flows from that functional need. So let me give you a few examples. One would be that the superhero comic is known originally for very bright colors. And stylistically, you could say, well, that's just an interesting choice. Bright colors are bombastic, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of drama. The reason that they're so bright and they're so day glow in the beginning is because of the technical limitations of the coloring, however. In most cases, the reason that Superman is bright red and bright blue is because it's cheaper to have your main character be made up of those primary colors, or not necessarily primary colors, but your basic like CMYK, right? Whatever colors are on the plate. And mixing them actually involved quite a complicated technical process of separating out different sort of halftone sort of patterns, and so that you would have mixing of those colors. And that's just expensive because you literally had to cut out twice as many masks, right? And all those things were done by hand. So if you look at the reason that a lot of those colors were chosen, there was a massive financial reason for that. You can see a similar concept happen with Disney when Disney was originally creating the character designs. And I think, again, this is one of those little anecdotes that I found fascinating, but they sort of figured out that if they added like an extra button to a character design, it kind of cost $20,000 over the entire production. So just redrawing, right? If you think about it, there's 2 buttons, right? They cost sort of $20,000 each over to the production budget in general to have, hundreds of people just redrawing those things. And 3 costs sort of $60,000, right? And so you can imagine that probably 0 buttons is better from a financial standpoint. If you really need a button, you have to prove it. You have to justify the need. Now, the entire style of the Disney animation look, which really did inspire a lot of comic book looks as well, because that style sort of, stemmed from illustration that was being done around the 20s and 30s. But again, there's a lot of technical reasons that the style of that sort of Disney animation looked like it did. There were technical limitations that were placed upon it. You can also see the whole concept of creating line illustrations is very much based off what prints well. So you could just sort of draw a pencil drawing, and prior to the printing press, right, and the need to reproduce illustrations, in many ways, in many cases, you would just draw in whatever medium you wanted. But once you sort of realized what would reproduce well on a printing press or a lithographic press or whatever sort of medium people are using, people start to create art to fit the production process, because you sort of create something and then you realize, you know what, if I make this more graphic, if I simplify the lines, if I sort of figure out what works when I'm creating the initial art,
All right, since my patrons asked for it, yes, if you join my Patreon, you can vote for what you want us to make videos on. Here's a video on the housing crisis. Yeah, it was pretty shit having my house set on fire, thanks for asking. I wouldn't categorize it as a crisis, though. It's more of just a terrible act of revenge by... Oh, what? You wanted a video on Australia's housing crisis, not my personal housing crisis, you selfish fucks. Well, to pivot back to me for a second, as I found out recently, it is bloody hard to get a rental in Australia, and when you do manage to find one, it's always on terms like this. Alright, 7 square metres, 2-week term, $20,000 bond, you'll be bunking with a 15-year-old Dagestani UFC fighter, because the landlord has hopes and dreams of training him into a champion one day, so you'll be doubling up as a punching bag every second day. There's not enough room for you and the punching bag. Fair? Can't believe I applied for that and still got turned down. I mean, you guys think you have a rental crisis. Imagine trying to apply for a house with that as your resume. I really didn't know how good I had it with my past landlord, who, by the way, is an absolute legend. Too bad I fucked it up by pissing off. And if you listen to corporate media, the one reason they give to explain this phenomenon over and over and over again is lack of supply. We need to let property developers into every primary school oval so they can build this in the middle of it. Well, you think the housing crisis is caused by the same factors that make Logan Paul and KSI's drink sell for $30? Well, maybe actually if Logan Paul and KSI are deliberately keeping supply low to push up prices, which, knowing Logan Paul, is kind of likely. By the way, Logan, if you're watching, that's a complete joke. I'm a maverick. Can you please let me on your podcast? I'm cool. I just want to ask you about your hidden superpower. You know, how your brain damage got rid of your ability to feel empathy. Hashtag Team Maverick. On census night 2021, there were 1 million empty homes. Admittedly, this was in the middle of the Delta lockdown in New South Wales and hard international border closure, but still, that's 10% of homes in Australia. But apparently, the only answer to solving our housing crisis is rezoning everything and building more, which, sure, I don't dispute that building more should be an aspect to the solution, but if your only answer to the housing crisis relies on having the most glowing, sycophantic, make-believe fairy tale view of perhaps the worst people in society, well, apart from YouTubers, obviously, developers, then you probably work in the Australian press. Oh yeah, we're building this shit as fast as we can. There's just so much red tape. Like, I didn't know you're not allowed to build in national parks. I mean, I did it anyway, but I had to fill out a form, so... Anyway, that's why we've got no choice. We're going to have to increase your rent to 100%. If a developer has to choose between reducing supply and making more money or increasing supply and losing money...
My pencil. I need them.
What do you think this guy is going to choose? Isn't it convenient that the only possible problem causing our housing crisis that ever gets floated is a lack of new houses being built? The only problem that has a solution that involves the elite making money. How's that? Read even a cursory amount of research and the notion that is propagated by property peak bodies and developers that just building more houses, that's going to solve the housing crisis. It's dispelled quicker than... I don't know, Logan Paul's empathy blocking nerves kicking in. Logan Paul's new Prime Vitamin range, empathy blockers. Scam your brother today. What would Logan do? Oh, that's right, I had his new range of empathy blockers. Now I can't ask that question. Anyway, NGO Prosper Australia has done recent research into this, analysing multiple greenfields developments, and it found that, surprise, surprise, developers deliberately adopt stage-released models of new developments, drip-feeding what is for sale, quote, crafted to avoid supply-led price declines. And the quote, after an average 9.5 years of production time, these master planned communities, or MPCs, still held 76.2% of their land bank vacant across all forms of permitted housing. So let me just put this on the records, guys. If you think that MPCs are going to solve it, you're an NPC. Ooh, I'm sure Sandra Sully knows what that is. Anyway, isn't it obvious? It still astounds me that developers are portrayed in this same way as charities. Fuck! Imagine if the press treated other industries as well as they do developers. With diamond scarcity hitting the roof, 10 investment analysts General Powerbottom is calling for the rebels to push past the Northern River and take the capital and the riches that come with it. We cannot dig up enough diamonds to keep up with demand. There are a lot of Tesla's real estate agents getting married this year. We have to increase supply. Real estate in this country does share a lot of parallels with blood diamonds. You deliberately restrict supply, you artificially inflate the value of your property portfolio, giving you more leverage to allow you to borrow more from the bank for future developments, which are now easier to get through because everyone's going on about a lack of supply. Rinse and repeat. Except the whole bank thing. With blood diamonds, you just buy more guns. But actually, it is a pretty shit analogy, but my main point stands. So, if just letting developers run Australia isn't going to solve our housing crisis, what is? Well, the question should be what was, and the answer was Bill Shorten. As always, not entirely, but fuck, it was a good start. If he was elected in 2019, the policies he was bringing to the table would have done a lot to stabilise housing prices. Instead, we got the political equivalent of a filthy one-night stand with said real estate agents. Yeah, fuck yeah, no negative gearing reforms, and if you want to keep your franking credits, you fucking well keep them, you dirty bitch. Oh. Hey, would you be able to order me an Uber home? Oh, you can't? Yeah, no, that's all right. I'll just hang around for a bit. To understand the root of Australia's housing problems, you got to understand the man that is also the root of almost all of Australia's other problems. A man that has such a funny voice that everything he does is forgivable. Former Australian Prime Minister John Howard. Before him, fuck, I'm such a millennial, but like, everything was better in the 80s. The Hawke government introduced the capital gains tax, a tax which treats profit on investments such as houses as taxable income. It's a pretty sensible tax, as it's not taxing hard work or innovations that actually add value to the economy. It's just modestly taxing speculation. Then in 1999, John Howard's Liberal government halved this tax for people that held their asset for longer than a year. Yeah, really rewarding long-term thinkers there. A year, with 70% of the benefit of this change going to the top 10% of income earners. And as you can see from this graph here, there's quite a jump in housing prices that coincides with this tax cut. Presumably from all the blood diver buying real estate agents who realise, oh, I can just second mortgage and sell it on in a year. Pay fuck all tax. What a fucking con. Also, since Howard's capital gains tax change, debt as a proportion of household income doubled. Bill Shorten came to both the 2016 and 2019 elections planning on reversing Howard's capital gains tax discount, which would have given the budget bottom line billions more every year and, you know, make houses less of an abstract asset to speculate on and more of a thing that it used to be, which was something to keep rain off you. Which at the time, our then Prime Minister, this French aristocrat displaced in time, now turned woke, enlightened hippie fisherman Malcolm Turnbull, viciously campaigned against these changes and instead, parroting this as the cause of Australia's housing woes, save a line, Bart. Lack of supply. Oh, and as always when it comes to Malcolm, but somehow the unions fall too. And you probably remember this, Morrison did the same thing in the 2019 election, with many in the commentariat crediting his opposition to Labor's changes as the reason for his quote-unquote miracle. How Christ-like, eh?
I'm gonna let you give even less to the poor. I bet you like that, don't you, you dirty fuckers?
As it said, obviously, there's been really no appetite to address this issue apart from the Liberal Party itself. In 2021, the New South Wales Liberal government realised, fuck, our federal counterparts have spent the last 20 years doing everything in their power to cause a housing crisis, and now we're going to have to deal with it. So they put in a submission to the federal government saying this 50% capital gains tax discount, quote, skews the incentives towards the purchases of properties for investment purposes. These tax benefits of property investment have contributed to the growing housing affordability issue. While the combined effect is likely to be a moderate increase in house prices, the most significant impact is the displacement of owner-occupiers, including first home buyers, from home ownership by tax-advantaged investors, predominantly those already on higher incomes. How cynical of Turnbull and Morrison. They ran such insane, blatant electioneering policy that it was opposed by those in their own party that had to deal with the consequences. By some, I might add, if we're going to use stupid political binaries, to the right of them. The New South Wales Liberal Party, the party of monopolist rent seekers who create no economic value, thought, nah, even this is a bridge too far for us. Everyone thinks of the coalition as the conservative political movement in Australia, but I've rejected this notion time and time again. They are the party of postmodernists that would put even the Frenchest wankers to shame. Instead of thinking of buildings as buildings and cars as cars, a company that provides a service is a company that provides a service. They think of all of these things as les assets. Le number of mots. They'd be content with gated cities sitting empty as masses clamour at the gates wanting shelter.